Begin this morning by sharing a couple of statistics with you. The first one is that 2/3 of American high school students will go on to attend college. The next statistic is that of those who go on to attend college, who in the past went to church every week, in the time that they go to college, 2/3 of those students will drop out of attending worship on a regular basis. And then the last statistic is, of those who drop out of attending worship on a regular basis, half say the reason is basically because of going to college itself. These numbers really just reflect what a lot of us have witnessed firsthand, which is that a lot of young disciples who go off to college often make shipwreck of their faith. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is just the very nature of higher education itself. The Bible warns us about the dangers of human wisdom that's disconnected from faith and God. Paul in Colossians 2 says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." And to the extent that higher education tempts students to abandon submission to God's way and choose to do things their own way, it mimics the strategy of the serpent in Genesis 3, who enticed Adam and Eve to ignore the will of God and become God on their own. And so instead of being a place where students bring apples to the teacher, when I was a kid, that's what happened. I'm not sure what goes on nowadays. But instead of being a place where students bring an apple to the teacher, higher education can sometimes become a place where the teacher offers the student the forbidden fruit of human autonomy, of doing it your way. Another factor behind the challenges of going off to college is that once you go off to school, you leave the constant oversight of your parents. College is usually the first time in a person's life when they have to get themselves up out of bed on a regular basis, when they have to feed themselves, and when they have to decide on their own whether they're going to go to worship or not. Unless their college has certain rules, it's the first time in their life when they can date whomever they want and do whatever they want. And it's all too easy to use that freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. I'm not suggesting, of course, that only those who go off to college are faced with the temptations of being puffed up by human wisdom or with the temptations of lukewarmness or lasciviousness. Those are issues that face disciples of all ages. But it just so happens that it is at this time in life when young disciples face these challenges for the first time on their own. So I thought, since this is a time of year when high school juniors and seniors make college visits, when it's a time of year when those who are lower classmen start to hone in on what they want to major in, when it's time when those who are about to graduate from college think about going to grad school, that it would be a good time to pause and reflect in a very practical way on how Christians should handle going off to school. I hope that this will be practical for all of our young ladies and gentlemen, not only for those who are going to go to school, but also that all of you, even if your intention is to embrace the noble occupations of vocational school or just go right on into work, that you'll find principles that will be helpful for you as well. I realize that we've had some stormy activity this morning. Maybe this will provide some good sound effects for my lesson today. And if you're worried, I would just remind you, I'm the one with electronic equipment strapped around his face. So I'm the one facing the gravest danger here this morning. I want you to look with me in Daniel chapter 1, not because this text is specifically about going off to college. It's not. But it does contain some principles that I think can be helpful, because it tells the story of some young people who are far away from home, who are educated against their will, just like many of you feel like you're being educated against your will. And I think there's some principles that we can learn here from this passage that can help all of us as strangers and exiles, but especially our young disciples as they enter school. So the time frame of the book of Daniel, we've studied the book of Isaiah. The first half of Isaiah talks about crises facing the nations of Israel and Judah at the hands of a country called Assyria. By the time of the end of the first half of the book of Isaiah, northern Israel has been carried off into captivity. God spares Jerusalem. But at the end of that first section of Isaiah, as you may recall in Isaiah 39, some messengers from Babylon come to visit King Hezekiah. And he shows them everything of value in the temple. Isaiah says, bad idea. Someday the Babylonians are going to come, and they're going to take some of these precious relics from the temple back to Babylon. And they're even going to come and take some of the royal household and take them back to serve as eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Well, Daniel 1 is the fulfillment of that warning. So verse 1 says, and by the way, Darren, so sorry that I hammered you with the most difficult scripture reading in the history of my experience here at Valrico. You handled it with much aplomb. So it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God, just like Isaiah said. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand at the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, just like Isaiah said. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Now, there's a very practical reason why the Babylonian king takes these young men back with him. First of all, in case the king of Jerusalem and the people of Judah decide to play smart with the Babylonians again, they've got hostages now that they can leverage against the monarch in Jerusalem should they try to rebel again. The other reason, though, is these young men are going to be trained, as you can see here, to serve as what we would call diplomats. They're going to be in the diplomatic service of the king. Their names are given. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. For some reason, we know Daniel by his Hebrew name, but we know the other 3 more by their Babylonian name. Many times in the Bible, when people go to another country like Joseph or like Hadassah, they are given new names. We know Hadassah more by her Persian name of Esther. It was a way for a monarch to indicate, I'm in charge now. I'm so much in charge, I can even give you a new name. And so Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, what I want you to see here in this text is, you have young men who are 1,000 miles away from home. They are immersed in a completely foreign culture. They are exiles, just like Peter says we all are in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. Our citizenship is in heaven, but we are here in a temporal kingdom like Mickey prayed about this morning. So how are they going to face and maintain their relationship with God in this kind of circumstance? So here's the first thing I want us to see this morning. You notice that verse 4 says that they were taught in the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Verse 5 says this is for 3 years. First thing I want to share with you this morning. All truth is God's truth. I wish I could remember who first said this that I heard, because this statement has kept me, I think, on a wise and even keel through the years that I went to school and that I went to graduate school. What do I mean when I say all truth is God's truth? Well, think about it. What could these Jewish boys learn from pagans? I mean, they already know the greatest truth of all. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What could pagans possibly teach them? When I say that all truth is God's truth, what I mean is this. Since God is the creator and sustainer of all reality, as Chase talked about in his table talk, then our knowledge of reality is knowledge of what God has done. And in that sense, all truth is God's truth. So, for example, when the wise man wants to instruct the sluggard. What does he point the sluggard to? Consider the ant. Now, the ant is made by God. The ant has a nature given to it by God. And the ant lives in an environment, in a world made by God. So that when he says, consider the ant, he's not referring to instructions given in tablets of stone from a mountaintop. He's literally talking about instruction given from the ground up. But it's something that he could learn by observing ants in their habitat and how they prepare to have food for when there won't be any food available. Well, if the sluggard can see that, do you think maybe a Babylonian wise man could as well? This is the reason why when you read the book of Proverbs, you see instructions that are very similar to instructions found in the literature of other ancient countries. Because the whole point of it is there are some things that we learn simply by virtue of how reality is. All truth in this sense is God's truth. The same is true when we study the natural sciences. A few weeks ago when I talked with you about how God heals physically, I made the point that because God is the creator and sustainer of the world, that when we look at things that we call natural processes, what we're really looking at is the work of God. It's just work that he does ordinarily and regularly. And I looked with you in Psalm 104, where the psalmist talks about things like God watering the trees and God feeding the lion with its prey and with God causing the grass to grow. And I made the point to you then in that sermon that scientifically, we study things and we call them photosynthesis, or we call it the water cycle, or we call it the food chain, and that's fine. But really, we understand that there would not be a nature or a creation at all without one to make it, so that we are studying the work of God. That's why the psalmist at the end of that psalm says, "O Lord, how manifold are your works." And the study of the natural sciences becomes an issue only when we try to disconnect the creation from the creator and assume that everything we see is merely the result of blind, random chance. That's not science, though. That's a dogma. Properly understood, when we study the natural sciences, we are studying the work of God because all truth is God's truth. And even when we do study the scriptures, that's the truth of God that's from the top down, revealed to us directly by God. That truth is written in a specific historical context like Daniel. And it's written in language, which has grammar. And there's logic that we apply to it. And that's why in education and things like history and literature and grammar and critical thinking all can become great tools for us to study the Word of God, so long as we remember we are applying this to the Word of God for the glory of God, because all truth is God's truth. And I don't mean to suggest the only way to be a good student of the Bible is to go have a college degree. I don't mean that at all. My dorm mother, my freshman year in college, was Mrs. Heaton, who is the mother of the nefarious Brad Heaton, right here in our very ranks. I was in Wilson Hall, and that's where the Heaton's apartment was. I used to love to go visit with Mrs. Heaton, in part because she constantly had chili and peanut butter sandwiches ready for me and sweet iced tea, so that was always a crowd pleaser. But Mrs. Heaton was one of the most well-read people I've ever met in my life. And Brad, she didn't really go to college at all, right? This was not someone who had higher education, but she was a thoughtful, reflective person. That's really what I'm talking about this morning. That can be such a great advantage as you learn the Word of God. In all cases, the value of an education is that it is a means to an end of glorifying God. It becomes a dead end, though, when we decide we can have an education without God. The wise man says in Ecclesiastes 2, how the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and striving after wind. Daniel took, and his friends took, what they learned from the Babylonians, but they used it for the glory of God. And that's what I'm suggesting for all of us this morning. One of my favorite illustrations along this line comes from an early church writer named Augustine. Augustine says this: you know how when the Israelites left Egypt, that before they left, the Lord said, go get the gold and silver and jewels from the Egyptians, plunder them. And if you're thinking, well, that sounds like robbery, well, remember, they've just worked as slaves without getting paid at all for centuries. So this is divine payback. But they took the plunder of the Egyptians and used it for the glory of God. And Augustine says, you know what? That's how to use education. You can learn from a pagan. And what pagans know are like those jewels, the pieces of gold and silver. He says, now these are, so to speak, their gold and silver, which they did not create themselves, but dug out of the mines of God's providence. In other words, all truth is God's truth, which are scattered everywhere abroad and are perversity and unlawfully prostituting to the worship of devils. Pagans use their education to worship idols. But he says, if you will bespoil them, therefore the Christian, when he separates in himself the spirit from the miserable fellowship of these men, ought to take away from them and to devote to their proper use in the preaching of the gospel. That's how to use higher education. If it's true, it's God's truth. Take it from whatever source you get. And if it comes from an unbeliever, that's fine. Just take it and use it for the glory of God. Just don't do what Israel went on to do and take the plunder and make an idol out of it. But if you will take it and use it like everything we do should be used, as Paul says at the end of 1 Corinthians 10, do all things for the glory of God, then you can be a successful exile receiving an education just like Daniel and his friends. Now, for those of you who are saying, well, this doesn't apply to me, because as soon as they say we're graduated from high school, that's the last class I ever intend to take in my life. And maybe you want to go straight into the workforce. That's fantastic. Or maybe you want to go into vocational training. That's wonderful. You can glorify God there as well. The principle, though, is the same. It's using what you have and do for the glory of God. Just like when Paul writes to the servants in Colossians 3:23 and says, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. And then to use it to help other people. Like Paul says in Ephesians 4, when he says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Whether you choose an academic or intellectual life, or whether you choose a life that's vocational, whatever that may be, the point is, do it for the glory of God. Do it to serve other people. But there is another factor involved here. When Peter says in 1 Peter 2:11, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, when he describes us as this, he urges us to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against the soul. A second key to dealing with this time in life, whether you are going off to school or just going into the workforce, is to abstain from fleshly lust. The issue of purity confronts Daniel and his friends in verse 8. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Now, we don't know exactly why Daniel was so concerned about being defiled. Part of it may have to do with the kosher food laws of Leviticus 11, although wine was not prohibited under those laws, and Daniel seems to want to divorce himself from the wine as much as from the food. Maybe it's also because in the ancient world, food was directly connected in many cases to the worship at pagan temples, like we read about in 1 Corinthians 10. And maybe Daniel just wants to step back from anything that may have been connected with pagan worship. Maybe it just boils down to this. look, they've given me a new home. They're giving me an education. They've even given me a new name. I need to do something just to preserve my unique identity as to what I was, and this is a way to draw the line. I don't know for sure. In any event, Daniel is concerned about his integrity and his purity. And God blesses him as a result. Verse 9 says, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age, so you would endanger my head with the king? I'm supposed to keep you all as the cream of the crop. I can't have you looking emaciated. Verse 11, Daniel says, I got an idea. Verse 12, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then he says, compare our appearance with these others and you'll see the results. Verse 14, he agrees. Verse 15, at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. Daniel knew that there was a war for his soul, and that he needed to take measures that might even be considered extreme in order to maintain his purity and identity as someone who believed in God. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you keep yourself pure in your personal life, that you will be at the top of your class. It's not what I'm promising. I do have some ideas, though, on how you can become fatter in flesh, just like they did. It starts with a lot of free peanut butter sandwiches and chili, and then you move on to ordering pizza late at night. I got plenty of other ideas, but that should be a good starter. The point I want you to see here, though, is that here Daniel and his friends, far from home, without any parental oversight, really without any spiritual guidance that we know of, were able to maintain their purity and integrity before the Lord. I love the prayer Daniel prays in the next chapter as he's about to help interpret a dream of Nebuchadnezzar, when he says in verse 23, to you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you've given me wisdom and insight. You're the God of my fathers, but now you are in a relationship with me, and I'm in a relationship with you. The reason Daniel kept his convictions is because they were his convictions. He maintained his faith because it was now his faith. And the fact that his zip code changed, if they had such things back then, did not change the relationship he had with God. Maybe these statistics that I shared with you that show young people losing their faith are not really about young people losing their faith. Maybe these are statistics about young people who never really had their own faith to begin with. And when they leave home, they take the spiritual investment that was given to them and treat it like the one-talent man and bury that faith in a hole in the ground. But a wise young disciple takes the spiritual investment of faith that's been bequeathed to them, and they compound it and make much of it. And to those young disciples, they will enter into the joy of their master, as Jesus tells the parable. One of the most crucial ways for any young disciple to make their faith their own is by becoming an active part of a family of believers when they are away from home. Now, Eric Netting already cruelly stole my big thunderous conclusion this morning because I wanted to commend our college students. Our homegrown students, which we have so many of now, we're so grateful for that. And also our out-of-town college students and our college-age young disciples who are working or taking technical training. You have truly embraced what it is to be a part of a spiritual family by teaching classes, by doing kind deeds for our members, by living out your faith. I hear our young people in the middle school and high school class rave about your teaching and how much they enjoy being with you in class. I've gotten cards from some of our college students. I got to tell you, when I was in college, it would have never occurred to me to write a card to any Christian. You impress me so much with your devotion and your commitment. You are growing in your own faith. And that is the way to thrive as an exile. And as I've talked about today, this transition in life from high school years through the college years into young adulthood, it is a crucial milestone in the journey of an exile. I can say from personal experience, though, it can be, and as some of you experience, one of the most joyful, happy times in life. The key is to pursue it to the glory of God, to pursue it with purity at heart, to serve other people. And then it can be one of the happiest stages in the journey of all of us strangers and pilgrims as we are making our way to the city that is to come. All of us are on that road. Some of us are further along the path than others. But we want to do whatever we can to help everyone, making our way as we look to the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. If we can help you, let us know while we stand and sing together.
Down at the cross where the Savior died, down where for cleansing from sin I cried, there to my heart was the blood of mine. Glory to His name, glory to His name, glory to His name. This time we'll be led in a closing prayer. We're so grateful for your presence this morning. If you're visiting with us, hang around for a moment or two and let us get to know you. Hand one of those visitors cards to someone. For everybody who's a member here, remember that we do have a congregation